Welcome to IQriously. Get comfortable. Take a slow breath. Tonight we are going to travel a very long way. Not just in distance, though we are going to the northeast corner of Africa, to a river valley that has been home to human civilization for over 6,000 years. We are going a long way in time as well. Further back than Rome. Further back than Greece. Further back than almost anything in the written record of human history. We are going to ancient Egypt, not to the pharaohs and the gold, though we will meet them. Not to the pyramids, though we will visit them. We are going to the daily life, to the farmers and bakers and scribes and children and craftsmen who made up the vast, breathing, complicated human reality of one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be. Just listen. 5,000 years ago, and indeed for thousands of years before that, and for thousands of years after Egypt existed for one reason: the Nile. Without the Nile, Egypt is desert. The land on either side of the river is, in many places, as desolate and lifeless as any on Earth. The Sahara presses in from the west. The eastern desert stretches to the Red Sea. The sun is brutal and the rain is almost non-existent. But the Nile changes everything. Every year, with a regularity that the ancient Egyptians came to regard as practically divine, the river flooded. It rose in late summer, spreading out across the floodplain on either side, covering the fields with water. And when it receded, weeks later, it left behind a deep layer of dark, rich, extraordinarily fertile soil. Black soil against the yellow desert. The ancient Egyptians called their homeland Kemet, the Black Land, as opposed to Deshret, the Red Land, the desert that surrounded it on every side. This annual flooding was the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization. It made the land productive far beyond what the climate alone would suggest. It made possible a surplus of food enough not only to feed the farming population, but to support priests and scribes and soldiers and craftsmen and artists and pharaohs, and the enormous administrative apparatus of a complex state. Without the flood, no surplus. Without surplus, no cities. Without cities, no civilization. The Greek historian Herodotus, visiting Egypt in the 5th century BC, captured it in a phrase that has echoed through history. Egypt, he said, is the gift of the Nile. Before we walk through the streets and fields of ancient Egypt, a moment to appreciate just how long this civilization lasted. The conventional dates for ancient Egyptian civilization run from approximately 3100 BC, when, according to tradition, a king called Narmer united Upper and Lower Egypt into a deep union. Single state to 30 BC, when the last Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra VII, died, and Egypt became a Roman province. 3,100 years. To put that in perspective, the span of time from Cleopatra's death to the present day is only about 2,000 years. The civilization of ancient Egypt was older when Cleopatra ruled it than her reign is to us today. The Roman Empire, which we tend to think of as ancient, would have seemed relatively recent to an educated Egyptian of Cleopatra's era. The pyramids at Giza were already over 2,000 years old when Julius Caesar visited Egypt. They were ancient history to the ancient Egyptians. And throughout all those millennia, through the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, through the rise and fall of dynasties, through invasions and occupations and periods of collapse and renaissance, the fundamental structures of daily life along the Nile remained remarkably consistent. Farmers planted and harvested. Scribes recorded. Priests performed rituals. Children played. Families gathered for meals. The river flooded and receded. Life continued. That continuity is itself one of the most remarkable things about ancient Egypt. A civilization stable enough and rooted enough in its relationship with its landscape to persist for over 3,000 years. In ancient Egypt, the year was divided not into 4 seasons, but into 3. Akhet, Peret, Shemu. Ahed was the flood season. Beginning around July, when the Nile rose and spread across the floodplain, it lasted for roughly 4 months. The fields were underwater. Farming was impossible. But the flooding season was not a time of idleness. This was when the state called upon its labor force for the great building projects that have defined Egypt in the world's imagination ever since. The pyramids were not built by slaves, we know this now, thanks to the discovery of workers' villages and their records. They were built by a rotating labor force of skilled and semi-skilled workers, drawn from the farming population during the months when the fields were underwater and agricultural work was impossible. These workers were fed and housed by the state. They were organized into gangs with names, friends of Khufu or drunkards of Menkaure, that suggest a pride in their work and a camaraderie among their members. They received medical care. Their injuries were treated. When they died on the job, they were given honorable burials. Building a pyramid was not a punishment. For many of the people who did it, it appears to have been a source of considerable pride. Peret was the growing season. As the floodwaters receded, they left behind that dark, fertile soil, and the farmers moved quickly to plant before the land dried out. Wheat, barley, flax, vegetable seeds scattered by hand into the rich black earth, the fields prepared with simple plows. Irrigation canals managed to extend the reach of the water beyond the immediate floodplain. Shemu was the harvest season. The crops ripened in the heat of late spring and were cut and gathered and stored against the year ahead. Tax collectors arrived because the state's claim on the harvest was an immovable feature of Egyptian life, and the accounting began. Year after year. Flood, plant, harvest. The rhythm of the Nile translated into the rhythm of human life. The majority of ancient Egyptians were farmers. Not the pharaohs and the priests who dominate our popular image of Egypt, but ordinary men and women who woke before dawn, worked through the morning before the heat became extreme, rested in the afternoon, worked again in the cooler hours of evening. Their homes were simple. Mud brick, the universal building material of the Nile Valley, cheap, abundant, practical. Thick walls kept out the worst of the summer heat. Flat roofs served as sleeping platforms on warm nights, as outdoor spaces for drying food and working in the shade of a mat stretched overhead. Inside, a typical farming home had 2 or 3 rooms. Sleeping area, storage, perhaps a small kitchen or cooking area, though much cooking was done outdoors to keep the heat out of the house. Furniture was minimal. A low bed, a chest for valuables, some ceramic pots and baskets. The farmer's wife ground grain each morning. This was one of the central sounds of Egyptian domestic life, the rhythmic scraping of the quernstone, the hand mill used to grind wheat or barley into flour. It was hard physical work, and the teeth of ancient Egyptians, when examined by archaeologists, often show severe wear from the small particles of stone that inevitably got into the flour. Bread was the staple. Dozens of varieties, flat and round and conical, plain and flavored with herbs or sweetened with dates. Beer was the universal drink, made from fermented grain, lower in alcohol than modern beer, nutritious and safe when the water sources were not. A typical meal for a farming family might be bread, beer, onions, garlic, leeks, and whatever vegetables the season provided. Fish from the Nile, occasional beans and lentils. Meat was a luxury, reserved for festivals and special occasions. The children helped. Boys went to the fields with their fathers. Girls helped their mothers at the quern and the cooking fire, learned to weave linen on simple looms, fetched water from the river in ceramic jars balanced on their heads. Life was hard, but it was not without its pleasures. When we look at ancient Egyptian art, the paintings on tomb walls, the carvings in temple halls, we see a people who took their leisure seriously. Music was everywhere. The ancient Egyptians played harps and lutes, flutes and oboes. Sistrums, a kind of rattle, sacred to the goddess Hathor, and various drums and percussion instruments. Professional musicians played at religious ceremonies and at wealthy banquets. In ordinary households, people sang at their work. Dancing was inseparable from music, and Egyptian dance was considerably more energetic and gymnastic than the slow, formal movements we might imagine. Tomb paintings show acrobats and dancers in mid-flip, legs extended, arms flung wide. Sport was enthusiastically pursued. Swimming in the Nile was universal. Children were taught to swim early, and it was simply part of life in a civilization built around a river. There was wrestling. There was archery. There was a sport that Egyptologists have translated as water jousting two boats on the river, each with a crew member trying to knock the other's crew member into the water with a long pole, while a second person steered. Board games were enormously popular. The most widely played was Senet, a game played on a board of 30 squares, in which players moved pieces through a track that represented the journey of the soul through the afterlife. It was so popular that Senet boards have been found across Egypt in enormous numbers, from simple scratched grids on flat stones to elaborately carved and painted sets that were buried with the wealthy as prized possessions. Tutankhamun's tomb contained 4 Senet boards. Children had toys, carved wooden animals with moving jaws controlled by strings, clay horses on wheeled platforms, dolls with moving limbs, balls stuffed with reeds. The ancient Egyptians liked to play. They found time for it even in lives of considerable physical labor. And they saw no contradiction between taking pleasure in life and taking their religious obligations seriously. Both were part of what it meant to live well. In a world without printing, without digital records, without any of the technological infrastructure we rely on for storing and transmitting information, the scribes were everything. They were the administrators, the record keepers, the tax collectors, the legal clerks, the authors, the accountants. They kept the machine of Egyptian civilization running. The Egyptian writing system hieroglyphics is one of the most beautiful scripts ever devised. At its full development, it contained over 700 signs, each one a small image. A bird, a water ripple, a seated noun, a basket with a handle. Each sign could represent a sound, or a word, or an idea, or some combination of all three. It is a complex and flexible system that took years to master. But this complexity was also part of the point. The fact that it took so long to learn meant that literacy was restricted to a relatively small professional class. The scribes who derived their status and livelihood from their ability to read and write. They had every reason to keep the system complex. Alongside hieroglyphics, there were simpler cursive scripts used for everyday writing, hieratic, used for administrative and religious documents on papyrus, and later demotic, an even more streamlined Al-D. Everyday script. A boy who was destined for the scribble profession began his training young, perhaps as early as 4 or 5 years old. He went to a school called the House of Life, attached to a temple or administrative center. He learned to write by copying texts over and over again. Wisdom literature, religious texts, administrative formulae. He was expected to memorize vast amounts of material. The texts he copied included admonitions to apply himself. A lazy student, the texts warned, would become a donkey, a burden carrier, doing the lowest and hardest physical labor. A diligent student would become the equal of a nobleman. The scribes knew their worth, and they made sure everyone else did too. Ancient Egypt was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably progressive in its treatment of women. Egyptian women could own property. They could buy and sell land. They could enter into legal contracts, testify in court, initiate divorce, and conduct business entirely in their own right. They were not the legal property of their husbands or fathers. This was genuinely unusual. In ancient Greece, which we often hold up as the cradle of democratic thought, citizen women had almost no legal existence independent of their male relatives. In ancient Rome, women were under perpetual legal guardianship. In ancient Egypt, a woman of ordinary means could own a house, inherit from her parents, and leave her property to whomever she chose. Women worked. Alongside the domestic responsibilities of home and children, Egyptian women were active in trade, in weaving and textile production, in the management of agricultural estates. Some women worked as musicians and dancers in temple settings. A few rose to positions of considerable administrative power. And occasionally, rarely, but unmistakably, women ruled Egypt as pharaoh. The most famous of these is Hatshepsut, who ruled in the 15th century BC as one of the most effective pharaohs of the New Kingdom. She managed not just to take power, but to hold it for over 20 years, overseeing military campaigns, international trade expeditions, and an ambitious building program that included one of the most beautiful temples in Egypt, her mortuary temple at Der el-Bahi. After her death, her successor attempted to erase her from the historical record, cutting her image from monuments and replacing it with his own. He failed. She was too deeply embedded in the stone and papyrus of her era to be completely removed. And she is now one of the most studied and celebrated figures in Egyptian history. Women were not equal to men in ancient Egypt. The pharaoh was always understood as male in cosmic terms, even when female in human ones. But they were considerably closer to equality than in most of the ancient world. The religious world of ancient Egypt was dense and complex, and deeply woven into every aspect of daily life. The Egyptians worshipped hundreds of gods, not in a confused polytheistic free-for-all, but in a sophisticated religious system with its own internal logic, its own regional variations, and its own long history of theological development. The gods were not distant or abstract. They were present. They had preferences and could be pleased or offended. They could intervene directly in human affairs, for good or ill. And they needed to be fed, clothed, and attended to tasks that were the responsibility of the temple priesthood. The great temples of Egypt at Karnak, at Luxor, at Abydos, at Edfu, were not public places of worship in the way that a modern church or mosque is. They were the houses of the gods. The statue of the deity at the center of the temple was literally the god's body, or at least the vessel through which the god's power resided on earth. Each morning the priests entered the inner sanctuary, opened the sealed shrine containing the divine statue, and performed a complex ritual. They removed yesterday's clothing and cosmetics. They bathed and anointed the statue. They dressed it in fresh linen. They offered food and drink and incense. They spoke prayers and performed rituals that reenacted the cosmological events of creation, maintaining the order of the universe for another day. Ordinary Egyptians did not participate in this inner temple ritual. Their religious life was expressed through festivals, through prayers and offerings at small household shrines, through the wearing of amulets, and through the great public processions when the divine statue enclosed in a portable shrine was carried out of the temple and along the streets while crowds gathered to catch a glimpse and to present petitions. The personal religious life of ordinary Egyptians was rich and varied. They wore amulets for protection, small carved figures of gods and sacred symbols hung at the neck or woven into clothing. They had household shrines where they burned incense and left offerings of food and flowers. They called on particular gods for particular needs. Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess, for protection in childbirth. Thes, a fierce dwarf deity, for the protection of children and the home. Thoth, the Ibish-headed god of writing and knowledge, for scribble success. The gods were companions in daily life, not frightening abstractions but familiar presences, appealed to in the same way you might ask a respected elder for help. No account of ancient Egyptian life would be complete without its death. For the Egyptians, death was not an ending. It was a transition, the beginning of a different kind of existence, no less real than this one, and in some ways more permanent. The details of Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife changed considerably over 3,000 years. But certain core ideas persisted. The soul, or rather the various components of the soul, since the Egyptians had a considerably more complex model of the self than we typically use needed to survive the death of the body. And for the soul to survive, the body needed to be preserved. This is why mummification was so important, and why it was practiced for so long and with such technical sophistication. The process, at its most elaborate and therefore most expensive, practiced by the wealthy and the royal, took 70 days. The internal organs were removed and stored in canopic jars. The brain was extracted through the nose using a special hock. The body was packed in natron, a naturally occurring salt, and left to dry for 40 days. Then it was wrapped in linen bandages, with amulets placed at specific points between the layers. A painted mask, gold for royalty, gilded cartonnage for wealthy individuals, painted linen for humbler people was placed over the face. The result was a body that could, at least in theory, last indefinitely. And indefinitely was the point. The deceased also needed things. The Egyptians placed enormous importance on providing for the dead food, drink, clothing, tools, games, furniture. In the earliest periods, actual objects were buried. Over time, this was supplemented by images painted scenes of feasting and farming and all the activities of daily life on tomb walls, which could magically supply the deceased with everything they needed for eternity. The Book of the Dead, not a single text, but a collection of spells and instructions compiled across many centuries, provided the deceased with the knowledge needed to navigate the dangers of the underworld. How to address particular guardians. How to identify yourself correctly before the gods. How to pass the final judgment. That judgment was vivid and precise. The heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. If the heart was heavier than the feather weighed down with wrongdoing and dishonesty, it was eaten by a mit, a hybrid beast part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. The soul would cease to exist. If the heart was lighter, if the deceased had lived a life of truth and fairness and compassion, they passed through to the afterlife, a place described as the field of reeds, a world much like Egypt itself, only without suffering, without scarcity, without the heat and difficulty and mortality of earthly life. The Egyptians did not think of death as the enemy of life. They thought of it as its completion. In the Valley of the Kings, the dry, cliff-enclosed valley on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, where the pharaohs of the New Kingdom were buried in tombs cut deep into the rock, there was a village. It was called Der Medina, the workers' village, and it housed the skilled craftsmen who carved and decorated the royal tombs. The tomb cutters, the plasterers, the painters, the sculptors. These men were specialists in a very particular kind of work. They spent their professional lives underground, in the flickering light of oil lamps, cutting into the limestone, applying plaster, painting the scenes and hieroglyphic texts that covered every surface of the royal burial. Chambers. Their own lives and their own records are survived in unusual detail. Because they were literate, they worked on royal tombs. They needed to read and write hieratic. They left behind an extraordinary archive of documents. Letters, legal records, accounts of disputes, records of work attendance, and something that makes them feel very contemporary indeed, accounts of strike action. In the 29th year of the reign of Ramesses III, approximately 1170 BC, the workers at Deir el-Medina went on strike. Their grain rations had not arrived for weeks. They were hungry. Their families were hungry. And so they downed tools, walked out of the valley, sat down outside the administrative offices, and refused to work until their wages were paid. It is the earliest recorded labor strike in human history. And it worked. The overseers scrambled to find rations. Grain was delivered. The workers returned to their tunnels. The papyrus records of this event were found in the 19th century and are now in museums in Europe. The names of the workers who sat down in that courtyard over 3,000 years ago are preserved in the record. Their protest, their hunger, their successful demand for fair treatment, all of it, remarkably, survived. We cannot talk about ancient Egypt without at least pausing at the pyramids. They are the most recognizable monuments in human history, the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the only one still standing. When the Roman orator Cicero made his list of the wonders, the pyramids were already ancient. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798 and stood before the Great Pyramid at Giza, he reportedly calculated that the stone in just the 3 Giza pyramids would be enough to build a wall 3 meters high and 30 centimeters thick around the entire border of France. Whether he actually did this calculation or not, the scale is right. The Great Pyramid, the tomb of the pharaoh Khufu, built around 2560 BC, is composed of approximately 2.3 million stone blocks. Each block weighs on average about 2.5 tons, though some interior blocks weigh significantly more. The total weight of the structure is estimated at roughly 6 million tons. It was built without wheels, without iron tools, without cranes or pulleys in the modern sense. The Egyptians used copper tools, wooden sledges, ramps of mud brick and rubble, and an organized labor force of remarkable scale and coordination. We still do not fully understand exactly how it was done. Several competing theories exist, none of them definitively proven. The Egyptians, characteristically, did not leave us a manual. What they left us was the pyramid itself. Standing in the desert outside Cairo, after 4,500 years, still the tallest ancient structure in the world. Its original outer casing, polished white Tura limestone that would have made it glow in the desert sun, is mostly gone, stripped for building material in the medieval period. But the core is intact. The precision of its construction is extraordinary. The base is level to within a few centimeters across its entire 230-meter length. The 4 sides align almost exactly with the 4 cardinal directions. The corners are almost perfect right angles. How? With what instruments? By what methods? 4,500 years later, we are still asking. 3,000 years of civilization did not end in a single dramatic moment. It faded. Gradually, through a series of conquests and occupations and cultural changes that slowly diluted the ancient Egyptian identity without ever quite eliminating it. The Assyrians invaded in the 7th century BC. The Persians conquered Egypt in 525 BC. Alexander the Great took Egypt in 332 BC. welcomed apparently as a liberator from Persian rule and recognized as a pharaoh in the traditional Egyptian way. After Alexander's death, Egypt was ruled by his general Ptolemy, and Ptolemy's descendants, the Ptolemaic dynasty. These were Macedonian Greeks ruling a deeply Egyptian society. They adopted Egyptian customs and titles, had themselves depicted as pharaohs on temple walls, and were worshipped as divine rulers in the Egyptian tradition. The last of them was Cleopatra VII, known to history simply as Cleopatra. She was the only member of her dynasty who bothered to learn the Egyptian language. She was brilliant, multilingual, politically astute, and ultimately unable to prevent the absorption of her kingdom into the Roman Empire, following the defeat of Mark Antony and herself by Octavian in 31 BC. When Cleopatra died in 30 BC, Egypt became a Roman province. The old temples continued to function for a while. Hieroglyphics continued to be carved. The rituals continued to be performed. But the world was changing, and the distinctive civilization of the Nile Valley was slowly subsumed into the broader Mediterranean world. The last known dated hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 AD, over 400 years into the Roman period. After that, the script fell silent. The knowledge of how to read it was lost. It was not recovered until 1822, when the French scholar Jean-François Champollion, working from the Rosetta Stone, finally cracked the code and returned the voice of ancient Egypt to the world. 3,000 years of recorded human experience, written in a script that no living person could read for over 1,000 years, and then suddenly, slowly, word by word, comprehensible again. The farmers are awake before dawn, grinding grain by lamplight. The Nile is beginning to recede, leaving dark soil on the banks. Children run down to the river's edge, laughing. In the great temple at Karnak, priests are performing the morning ritual, opening the shrine, dressing the god in fresh linen, speaking words that have been spoken for 1,000 years and will be spoken for 1,000 more. In a workshop in the Valley of the Kings, a painter is mixing pigment red ochre, yellow ochre, black from soot, white from chalk, blue and green from carefully prepared minerals, and is filling in the outline of a scene that will remain visible, sealed in a dry rock tomb for 3,000 years. He does not know that. He is simply doing his work. Somewhere along the river, a scribe is writing a letter. A mother is feeding her baby. A boy is playing Senet with his sister by lamplight. A man is standing at the water's edge, watching the moon reflect off the slow river, thinking whatever it is that people have always thought at such moments. Ancient Egypt is not really ancient. Not in the ways that matter. It was built by people who loved their children, argued with their neighbors, went on strike when they weren't paid, played board games, grieved their dead, looked up at the same night sky you are looking at tonight, and wondered what it all meant. 3,000 years. And underneath all of it, the same ordinary, extraordinary human life. Thank you for spending this time with IQriously. Rest well.